One of the more frustrating things I've experienced over my lengthy career has been the rise of fads and the rise of public relations based policy rather than fact based policy like they have in other parts of the world. I was a peer editor of the International Journal for Drug Policy and was actually a policy expert. And so in my dissertation work at CU. And one of the things that struck me looking at peer reviewing articles is how the rest of the world really was advanced in their policy making because they were fact-based, whereas we had a political-based reality where we could enact various laws dependent upon the publicity and the following they were able to generate. So we had, for instance, in my undergraduate and graduate days, they had a specialty at the University of Colorado called corrections. They had offered a master's in it. And if you looked at the curriculum, it had courses like how do you get along with your neighbors, how do you get a job, how do you fill out job applications. The training was pretty much like social workers. And what the goal was, it consisted of policies and pedagogies, teaching methods, pedagogies, I guess they're called, based on how do you get somebody who has been in the slammer and is getting out of the slammer, how do you get him to adjust to reality, to the community or whatever? You don't give him $50 on a bus ticket and say, here, you're free. Try to stay out of trouble so we don't see you again. These people need training. They need counseling. They need facilities. They need various things to help them adjust. And they used to train people to do this. They had about approximately the same training as social workers and did about the same thing. They helped them get jobs, they helped them get housing, they helped them adjust. They did more than just keep track of them to make sure they weren't reoffending. But that's expensive to have counselors do these kinds of things. It's much cheaper just to lock them up and pay guards minimum wage or a little more than minimum wage and not worry about them, and then make them responsible for themselves when you turn them loose. In order to promote this, we've elevated psychologists and people like that to almost godlike status, and we've forgotten criminologists and social scientists. To do so, we have to then elevate psychologists because everything is based on psychology and psychological evaluation, which is absolutely stupid, but it's cheaper. And you can say, well, this guy is psychologically screwed up, let's give him this drug, or let's give him that treatment, or let's put a guard on him, or let's do all these other things, and placing the duty upon the convict or miscreant to correct himself, and if he can't do it, he goes back, and then we get him on the treadmill, and he's back and forth, and pretty soon he becomes institutionalized and doesn't want to live anywhere outside of the institution, and he can't adjust. And you have the Shawshank Redemption syndrome going on. Now, it's really ironic because in the 1930s, sociologists came up with the concentric ring theory out of the University of Chicago. The sociologist named Park, Burgess, and Shaw. And what they found was that crime rates in a certain area stayed constant no matter who was there. So crime became a cultural thing. It became a sociological thing and not a psychological thing. Convicts weren't bred and have genetic defects because their parents lived in a certain area. They were that way because the area made them that way. And you had all kinds of theories coming from that, like looking glass theory and labeling theories, and a lot of stuff that made a lot of sense. But we had to then take responsibility for creating these so-called monsters, or whatever we want to call them. And it's much easier to say, well, their mother and father were inbred, or their mother and father were defective, or somehow the genes were defective, and therefore we have a criminal, and the criminal made himself a criminal. He made himself psychotic, he made himself this, that, or the other, and it's his fault. And what he's got to do is pick himself up by the bootstraps and quit being a criminal. Better said than done. Because that assumes that an environment or sociological background doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter whether he had a neglected home or whether he had a criminogenic environment or whatever. He could have corrected it himself if he were the right kind of person and had the right kind of psychology. And if not, then the psychologist can help him. Now, I view that as absolute bullshit, but I'm in a minority right now. And this view of self-determination became institutionalized from Nixon on, and every time a Republican got in office, it became more and more institutionalized. So, for instance, as a defense attorney, I used to be able to go into a person's background, find research on the background, and be able to argue the guy's upbringing, environment, etc., in mitigation. Well, legislators decided that was bad. We didn't need that. And we didn't need that as a good policy. And they came up with a matrix type sentencing protocol, which said it didn't matter. Pardon me a second, I come unplugged here. And, you know, even the judges got brainwashed, and you'd hear them say at a sentencing hearing, well, Mr. Smith, you know, you're going to go to the slammer, and I don't want to send you there, but I have to because of your psych tests and everything else. And I hope you learn something by your visitation there. Even though I'm putting you in a criminogenic environment, I expect you to be stronger than that and come out a model citizen. And it's time that you start being responsible for your actions. And it's because you're there, and I'm putting you there because of your actions, because of what you did, and because you don't show any remorse for the actions, etc. And they have all this bullshit line that they tell various prisoners, depending upon the circumstances. Occasionally, if a judge gets too carried away, or if I get pissed off enough, I'll look at the judge and I'll say, you know, Judge, my client will take responsibility for his actions when society takes responsibility for making him that way. Since most judges are trained by district attorney, they get offended with this because they have to believe there's a bad apple or a bad soul or whatever. And society has nothing to do with it. And the fact we have monstrous redistribution of wealth and extreme poverty and things like this, capitalist greed, doesn't matter, because if the person were much of a person, he could overcome this and become George Washington or some sort of delusional thought like that. They feed you the propaganda but don't give you the Kool-Aid to go along with it, apparently. So to institutionalize this, they came up with this matrix, sentencing matrix. It's a questionnaire. It has a bunch of reasons for sentencing, none of which are environmental, none of which are sociological. They're all psychological in nature, or judgmental in nature, or theological in nature sometimes, but they're giving you points on the matrix whether or not you can be on probation. And the probation is based on risk assessment and not on correctional ability, or whether or not a skilled practitioner of corrections could have an impact. They want to know, are you going to be a recidivist? Well, there's a middle class bias there, or an anti-poverty bias probably, because these people, when they're released, they don't have an environment that's not criminogenic that they can go into. You know, the country clubber can go back to the country club and have a few embarrassing moments, but he can get a non-criminogenic support group. The ghetto dweller is much more unlikely to have that happen. So we've institutionalized psychology, and then we can take algorithms based on psychology, whether he's impulsive or hysterical or antisocial or sociopathic, psychopathic, whatever. And we can use these to set up programs, and we can use these to hire experts that can do certain things, and we can pay a lot of money to these witch doctor experts, and we're doing our job to fight crime. Which is a big farce, but it does help support a whole prison industrial complex, which do nothing but invent programs that don't work. Some of them do, but they invent programs, and then they get they make their money by charging the poor people just released from prison for their own rehabilitation, which doesn't really exist because it doesn't go to primary causes, and it's just a round robin. So what they've got is they've got a built-in population with obsolescence that's built in, and they can perpetuate this prison machine forever. And they've got a gullible public that wants to believe that it's possible that these people can go to prison and serve their time and come out productive citizens. Now it gets worse now with boutique crimes. And this week I've had 2 ex-clients come to me, and I'm thankful I surrendered my license because these would be difficult cases, and of course they don't have the capacity or economic ability to fight. But one of them was charged with domestic violence, and his girlfriend, who lived with him, got pissed off once, called the police. The police came and arrested him on a must arrest policy, and they gave him an automatic restraining order to his girlfriend, and somehow they met over a Coke somewhere and made up, and he proposed to her. They flew off to Reno to get married, and after he came back to Colorado, he got arrested for violating the restraining order. And it didn't matter whether the now wife wanted him arrested or wanted him prosecuted for violating the restraining order. They took it upon themselves to do it pro se. So the government just did it because they were pissed off. They didn't get the government's permission to go get married, and he violated the restraining order because he decided to get married and went ahead and did so. And one of the magazines or newspapers in Boulder wrote it up and ridiculed the deputy district attorney that was in charge of the case. And after the ridicule, she vengefully blackmailed or blackballed the defendant, and they punished her by making her a judge in a different county. And even though she's still embarrassed by the bad publicity for her lack of common sense. So I get a call from this guy 20 years later, and the press kind of labeled or set the scene of his elopement sort of to the tune of Romeo and Juliet with the balcony scene. And it was a very well-written article and very funny, very comic, very sarcastic. Anyway, 20 years later, this guy deals in secondhand material and sells it on Amazon and various online auctions, etc. And he bid for some surplus lumber at the state penitentiary, which is 100 miles away, a good 2-hour drive, maybe 3. So he goes out there with his truck. The guy's in his 70s now. And he's told by the guards that he can't pick up the lumber that he's bid on and paid for and got title to because he has an arrest record for domestic violence. Now he calls me, he had to leave without getting it. And somebody in the Bureau of Prisons for Colorado said they were going to look at it. I wanted to write another article, but he wouldn't let me. I wanted to call the Attorney General, and he wouldn't let me. And do these other things. He said he wanted to give him a day or two to work at it. But from my point of view, that's ridiculously vindictive policy. And if the ex-prosecutor, or now judge, put something in his file that caused this to happen, then she doesn't deserve to be a judge. She doesn't deserve to get a state paycheck. She doesn't deserve to be not held accountable. And from my point of view, she doesn't deserve to have a law license. That isn't practicing law, that's revenge. And we shouldn't allow our officials to have revenge. Another thing going on right now under that title is there's a district attorney in Boulder who was aware of the so-called Tannenbaum case, which toppled the government, according to some writers, which had the subject of a lot of hearings in the Senate and the House. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, for one, exposed some of the bad practices of the IRS, the CIA, the NSA, Memorette, and things such as these. And they were going to reinvestigate that thing. And one of the things that happened with the Tannenbaum case is 2 of my letters addressed to me in my office never reached me, but were mistakenly addressed to the FBI office in Boulder, which is a counterintelligence office. So prior DAs have let me look at the file, and I had occasion, since they were making a movie of it, of the case, to want to look at the file again to refresh my memory. Well, this case made the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, etc. It stayed in the paper for quite a while. It involved Henry Kissinger's first graduate student and the sister of a top scientist at Los Alamos, and several intelligence agencies, the scuttling of the Houston plan, the Watergate hearings. All of this is connected to this one case. So I called the district attorney's office and asked to review the file. The file also showed that my client at the state hospital was pretty much shows her by induction, indicates that she was murdered by cyanide poisoning. Anyway, I wanted to review the file. The guy denied on the basis that it was an ongoing investigation. Now, the incident was 50 years ago. I'm certain in my own mind that I upset somebody in the intelligence community, and they put in a good word for me, saying, don't give this guy access to the file because he's going to talk about it, he's going to rat it off, and he's been in contact with people like Netflix agents, etc., to publicize some of this, and we don't want the extra heat because it's hard enough to maintain our illegal activities such as Guantanamo and things like this, let alone making some of this publicized. So keep him away from the data and shut him up. I mean, I can't help but feel that way. And it's happening to other people like this client of mine on the domestic violence case. I also have another client that was charged with possession of child pornography that he did on Photoshop, and there wasn't any child used at all for the pornography. It was all Photoshop. And with each of the child thing, he would write a poem. He maintained his poetry, but he pleaded guilty, and now he's a sex offender, and they keep denying him jobs. He has to go to sex offender treatment, and he's in his 70s, and he's on Social Security, but he has to pay for the treatment, and he has to pay for the blood test, the breath test, etc. And he can't afford it. So now they're telling him he's got to get a job because his Social Security check isn't big enough to pay for all these services that he's been ordered to do. And he couldn't do that, and he couldn't keep up his payments, so now he's in violation of his probation, and they're wanting to put this old man in the penitentiary. There's no common sense. There used to be a rule of reason. There used to be a rule of proportionality, but now prosecutors have got so much power, and they can ignore us criminologists as much as they want because they can get forensic psychologists that will testify about anything they want testified to. So that case is bugging me. A third case, I've got a guy who used to be my investigator, worked on some government projects with me, and a realtor was taking pictures of his house and went into his house when he asked her because he was upset she was taking pictures. And one of the reasons was that he was targeted by the CIA, as was I, although they never attempted to assassinate him. But we're very leery of government agents and snoops and things like this. And the guy wanted to look at what was on the woman's camera. It was a digital camera. She pulled away and banged her wrist, I think, on a table probably, and claimed that he assaulted her. Now she's in her 70s also. So you got two people in their 70s. The police come from Netherlands, and they talk to the lady first, who was trespassing, who went into the guy's house, refused to show the camera, and got panicked and hysterical and left. They talked to her first and determined she was fearful and shaky and etc. and has a bruise. Now, when you get to be our age, you get bruised all the time. I don't know where my bruises come from, but I got a lot of them. Anyway, armed with the bruise evidence, they went to his house. They interrogated him. He was under the finger of suspicion, and they charged him with an assault on an elderly. Now, this guy's had several brain operations, brain tumors. He was in an avalanche on the road, got hit in the head by a rock, his vehicle destroyed, his mobility cart destroyed. I had an extra one, so I gave it to him. He's in a wheelchair in his house because he can't get around. And they came to interview this guy in the wheelchair. And he's known to the police officer there. They knew right away who he was because he also did some private investigative work. He's also a consultant internationally on various forensic matters. And they issue him a felony summons for assault on an elderly because a woman came into his house, and when he grabbed for the camera, she hurt herself. And she feared for her safety and feared for her personal safety and the fact that she would be harmed. Now, this is kind of a bullshit thing that prosecutors and cops put into the mouths of people they want as complaining witnesses. Anyway, the case should have been dismissed, and rather than that, they're prosecuting him, and they're going full blast. It's been going on for ages. There was a restraining order hearing where she said she was afraid that my client would assassinate him, and all this other bullshit that the trial judge there ignored and thought was, frivolous or whatever. But the DA's still going on because they want to run their statistics up, because they don't like criminologists, they don't like sociologists, they don't like to use their heads. They read a statute and say, aha, that's a statute. Who's capable? And we'll make reality fit our statute. And then we can get more money for this, and we can build the perpetual prison machine, and it's no skin off our balls because we don't have to pay for it. And so what if a guy's on Social Security, or so what if he doesn't have any money? That's our problem. Let another department deal with that. Or if he can't pay to stay out of prison, send him to the Slimer, and he becomes good meat for the other convicts. Who cares? Who gives a damn? The DA's office in Boulder County sure as hell doesn't. And while I'm on this crusade, I wish you'd call the DA's office and tell them to get real. Or if they're going to take this flavored Kool-Aid, maybe they should do like Jones did and put something stronger in it. In any event, that's my rant for today. I hope you comment. I hope you send me an email calling me a jerk or an asshole or anything you want, but I want comments. I want feedback on this. The reason is that I'm dealing with some other entities to do a video series that's going to go on a network type thing, and they're going to edit this stuff because I can't afford a staff. I can't afford to edit, and I'm doing the best I can to get the information out there that I can. And what I need is somebody to put this together in a logical fashion, in a format that attracts people rather than rejects people. And I can only piss so many people off for so long, and then they forget about it and don't pay attention. Besides that, people just don't like looking at my ugly face for a half hour at a time while I'm spewing off this venomous sputum, I guess you could call it. Those dinosaurs do salivate. Anyway, please give me some feedback. Hate mail or whatever you want to do. This is Dennis the Dangerous Dinosaur signing out.